Picture this. You are marching through a forest so dense it swallows sound. The light doesn't fall through the canopy. It bleeds. Thin, amber slants of late summer afternoon pushing through oak and hickory, and towering chestnuts so thick your column is walking in permanent twilight. Even at 3 in the afternoon, the air is wet with heat. Your wool uniform, the brilliant red that was supposed to make you look invincible, has been soaked through for hours. It clings to your back like a second skin, and it chafes at the collar with every step. Your boots have gone soft from creek crossings. The pack on your back carries 60 pounds, musket, cartridge pouch, bayonet, 5 days of biscuit and salt pork, and a canvas haversack already starting to smell in the August heat. You haven't slept properly in 3 days. Somewhere up ahead, two men are talking in voices low enough that you can't hear the words, only the rhythm. You try to catch it. Is it orders? Is it a warning? But the forest absorbs everything, bounces it back, changed, makes it impossible to know whether what you're hearing is your own fear or something real. And then it comes. Not gradually, not with warning. All at once, from both sides of the trail, from above your column and ahead of it and behind it, from everywhere and nowhere at the same time, the forest erupts. War cries in a dozen indigenous languages. The bark of muskets from men you cannot see, firing from behind trees you cannot identify, at ranges of sometimes 10 feet, sometimes 50, sometimes invisible snipers who blend with the forest so perfectly they seem to be part of it. Men in your column are going down. Some fall without a sound. Some scream. The man directly in front of you spins sideways and drops, and you see the blood on his temple, and your brain hasn't fully processed what your eyes are telling it. You can't form a line. The trail is too narrow. You can't charge. You can't find the enemy. You can't run. The ambush is behind you too. For 200 men of the British Army, deep in the Pennsylvania wilderness in August of 1763, this is not a tactical problem. This is a death sentence. This is the forest itself deciding you don't belong here. And the question that Colonel Henry Bouquet, somewhere in this column, is asking himself right now, the question that will determine whether 400 more men live or die, is the one question that no military academy in Europe had ever thought to prepare him for. How do you fight an enemy you cannot see? Welcome. I'm glad you're here today, because this story, the Battle of Bushy Run, is one of the most tactically brilliant and historically underappreciated military engagements in the history of North America. A man took an impossible situation, a type of ambush that had killed European armies before, and invented a solution on the spot, under fire, with his men dying around him. But before we get to that moment, before we watch Henry Bouquet pull off one of the most audacious battlefield deceptions in the colonial era, we need to understand exactly how desperate the situation was. And for that, we need to go much further back. Because this battle didn't begin in that Pennsylvania forest in August of 1763. It began years earlier in a slow accumulation of broken promises, frontier violence, cultural misunderstanding, and a catastrophic failure of colonial imagination. If this kind of story, the kind where strategy and humanity and high stakes collide in a forest no wider than your street, if that sounds like your thing, hit subscribe before we go any further, and drop a comment right now and tell me where you're watching from. I've had people watching from London, from Pittsburgh, from Toronto, from Germany. Every time someone tells me they're watching from a place connected to this history, it makes this whole thing feel more alive, more real, because this story deserves to be real to you. This deserves to matter. Let's go. This is not a story about a skirmish in the woods. Let me be very clear about that. I know what you might be tempted to think, that Bushy Run is a minor footnote compared to the grand engagements of European warfare. or to a few hundred men in a Pennsylvania forest, nothing like the sweeping cavalry charges and cannon fire of the great battles of history. That's not what this is. The Battle of Bushy Run in August of 1763 was the decisive engagement in one of the most existential conflicts the British Empire faced in North America. A conflict that, if it had ended differently, would have fundamentally altered the shape of what eventually became the United States. A conflict that, and I want you to sit with this, nearly erased the entire British colonial presence west of the Appalachian Mountains. Not weakened it, not pushed it back, erased it. Between May and August of 1763, indigenous warriors under the broad coalition inspired by the Ottawa war leader Pontiac had captured or destroyed 8 British forts across the Great Lakes region and the Ohio Valley. To 8 forts in less than 4 months. Fort Sandusky, Fort St. Joseph, Fort Miami, Fort Ouiatonneau, Fort Michilimackinac, Fort Venango, Fort Le Boeuf, Fort Presque Isle. Each one fell. Garrisons were killed or captured, supply lines were cut. The British Western military presence was being systematically dismantled by warriors who understood the terrain, understood the tactics of forest warfare, and were fighting for something far more urgent than imperial policy. They were fighting for survival. And the only thing standing between the collapse of the entire British Western position and total catastrophe was a fort that refused to fall. Fort Pitt, and the great stone and earthwork fortification at the fork of the Ohio River, the place where the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers meet to form the Ohio, had been under siege since mid-June of 1763. 500 soldiers and civilians inside. The wilderness pressing in on every side. No relief in sight. Think about that for a moment. The British military, the same military that had just won the 7 Years' War, the global conflict that had driven the French from North America, was being slowly strangled in its own frontier fortifications. The victories against France had been glorious, decisive, world-altering. And somehow, the organization that had accomplished all of that couldn't figure out how to fight in a forest. If Fort Pitt falls, if that garrison is overrun or starved out or forced to surrender, then the British have lost the Ohio Valley. They have lost the gateway to the interior of the continent. The entire strategic logic of the 7 Years' War, the reason tens of thousands of men had died in an 8-year global conflict, collapses. The French are gone, but the British can't hold what they've won. The indigenous coalition has demonstrated that European military power is essentially impotent in North American forest warfare. The consequences for what follows, the American Revolution, the westward expansion, the entire political geography of the continent, are enormous and incalculable. The thread connecting August 1763 to the world you live in right now runs through a Pennsylvania forest at a place called Bushy Run. And that thread was held by one Swiss-born officer with 460 men, 5 days of rations, and a mind that was about to do something no British commander had ever done. To understand Bushy Run, you have to understand the world it grew from. Go back to 1754. The Ohio Valley. The Ohio Country, the region between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River, was one of the most contested pieces of real estate in North America. Extraordinarily fertile, rich in fur-bearing animals, threaded with navigable rivers, home to dozens of indigenous nations who had lived there for centuries. The French were building forts to anchor their continental claims. The British colonial governments, especially Virginia and Pennsylvania, wanted the same land for expansion, for the fur trade, for the relentless population pressure building along the eastern seaboard. The indigenous peoples, the Delaware, the Shawnee, the Mingo, the Wyandot, the nations of the Iroquois Confederacy, were caught between 2 empires, each trying to use them as allies, buffers, and trading partners. All of them understood, at some level, what neither European power was willing to admit. The outcome of this contest would decide what happened to their world, not just politically, existentially. In 1754, a 22-year-old Virginia militia officer named George Washington fired the first shots of what became the 7 Years' War, the first genuinely global conflict in human history. When it ended in 1763 with the Treaty of Paris, Britain had won, comprehensively. France ceded Canada, the Ohio Valley, the Mississippi Corridor. On the map of North America was redrawn. One power from the Atlantic to the Mississippi. But the British did not understand what their victory meant to the people who already lived there. The French relationship with indigenous nations, whatever its failures, was built on genuine interdependence. French traders lived in indigenous communities. French men took indigenous wives. The fur trade required collaboration, and collaboration requires a minimum of mutual respect. The British relationship was fundamentally different. British settlers came not to trade, but to farm, to replace the forest with fields, the old world with a new one that had no room for anyone else. And when the French buffer disappeared, say a set of policies came out of London so catastrophically tone-deaf to frontier reality that they seem almost designed to cause exactly the explosion that followed. General Jeffrey Amherst, Commander-in-Chief of British forces in North America, decided to end the practice of gift-giving to indigenous allies. This requires context. Gift-giving wasn't bribery in indigenous political culture. It was protocol, relationship maintenance, the physical language of alliance and respect. When Amherst ended it, calling it wasteful and unnecessary now that the French were gone, he wasn't just being cheap. He was announcing, in a language the frontier understood completely, that the British no longer considered indigenous peoples worth respecting. He also restricted the sale of ammunition and gunpowder to indigenous communities, cutting off the means by which families fed themselves, defended their villages, sustained their way of life. He dismissed warnings from frontier officers. He ignored petitions from indigenous leaders. He spoke privately about indigenous peoples in terms that reveal not just racism, but a profound category error. He genuinely did not understand that he was dealing with people who had their own political logic, their own red lines, their own capacity to be pushed past the point of no return. He was receiving reports every week telling him something was building. Warriors gathering, councils being held that hadn't been held in decades, frontier traders hearing things in the forest. He ignored every one of them. Think about that. With the comfort of a New York headquarters, the dispatches piling up from people who were actually there, actually living on the edge of what was coming. And the response, essentially, was, they wouldn't dare. They dared. In the spring of 1763, a coalition of indigenous nations, loosely coordinated around the charismatic Ottawa leader Pontiac, and fueled by a spiritual revival preached by a Delaware prophet named Neolin, launched what historians have called Pontiac's War. Whatever you call it, the military achievement was extraordinary. In 3 months, from May to August of 1763, indigenous warriors using guerrilla and ambush tactics eliminated nearly the entire British military presence west of Fort Pitt and Fort Niagara. 8 forts destroyed or abandoned, hundreds of soldiers killed or captured, or the frontier itself, the thin line of farms and settlements scratching at the Ohio Valley's edge, was in flames. How did they do it? How did warriors armed primarily with muskets, bows, and tomahawks dismantle one imperial military position after another? First, perfect intelligence. The indigenous coalition had eyes everywhere on the frontier. Traders, runners, diplomatic contacts, family networks stretched across hundreds of miles of territory. They knew where British garrisons were weak. They knew supply schedules and reinforcement timelines. While British headquarters in New York received frontier news 3 weeks after it happened, the warriors in the forest were operating on real-time intelligence gathered by people who belonged to that landscape. Second, deception, or the opening strikes of Pontiac's War were almost entirely built on misdirection. At Fort Michilimackinac on June 4th, 1763, the king's birthday, Ojibwa warriors staged a game of lacrosse outside the fort's walls. The garrison, relaxed and festive, watched. Players gradually moved toward the open gate. Then the ball was thrown over the wall. Warriors ran in to retrieve it, while women who had gathered to watch, concealing weapons under their blankets, passed them to the men. 20 British soldiers died in minutes. The fort was taken before anyone fully understood what was happening. Third, the terrain itself. The British military in 1763 was trained for European warfare. Line infantry, volley fire, coordinated flanking across open fields. The forests of Pennsylvania and the Great Lakes were a different universe. The old-growth trees offered snipers near impunity. Ravines created natural kill zones. Trails that were the only practical routes through the wilderness became perfect ambush corridors, simply by placing warriors on both elevated sides. Your bright red uniform, which made sense in Flanders, where commanders needed to identify unit positions at a glance, made you a target in a forest. You were a splash of crimson against brown bark. The warriors fighting you wore clothing that blended with the landscape so completely that soldiers sometimes couldn't locate a shooter who had just fired from 30 feet away. Fourth, motivation. The men fighting under Pontiac were not conquering. They were protecting something, their families, their hunting grounds, and their right to exist on land their people had inhabited for centuries before anyone in London had ever heard of the Ohio River. That kind of motivation, defensive, protective, existential, produces a quality of warrior that professional soldiers struggle to understand. Men who fight for survival fight differently than men who fight for wages or discipline. They fight smarter. They absorb more punishment because the alternative is not a tactical defeat. It's the end of everything they know. By summer of 1763, these warriors had essentially proven that the British Army was incapable of projecting military power in North American forest warfare. And at the center of it all, Fort Pitt was dying. Slowly. The warriors surrounding it couldn't storm the earthwork fortifications. Those were well designed and heavily manned. But they could starve it, kill every foraging party that ventured beyond the walls. Wait. The garrison inside was eating reduced rations. Disease was spreading. The commander, Captain Simeon Ecuyer, was making the calculations that isolated officers in desperate positions always make. How long can we hold? And on the other side of the Appalachian Mountains, in Philadelphia, a Swiss-born British officer named Henry Bouquet was reading those dispatches and making his own. Henry Bouquet is one of history's undersung military minds, and I want you to understand why he was different from the commanders who had failed before him, because the difference matters enormously to what happens at Bushy Run. He was born in 1719 in Rolle, a small town on the shore of Lake Geneva in Switzerland. But he grew up in a tradition of professional soldiering that was simultaneously European in its training and intellectually curious in its approach. Switzerland exported soldiers in this era, professionals of extraordinary quality, trained for a continent where warfare was constant and varied. But the Swiss military tradition also expected officers to think, not just obey, to understand terrain, to adapt. Bouquet spent years in service to Sardinia and then the Dutch Republic before entering British service in 1756. He was given command of the 60th Regiment of Foot, the Royal Americans, a unit specifically designed to include American-born soldiers and operate in North American conditions. Bouquet wasn't just a commander who executed European doctrine in a new environment. But he was an officer who genuinely thought about how to fight differently. He read everything he could find about indigenous military tactics. He experimented during the 7 Years' War, using light infantry and skirmish formation rather than rigid lines, adapting the European concept of flankers to the specific demands of Pennsylvania forest. He understood something that most British officers refused to accept: that fighting in North American wilderness required a fundamentally different tactical vocabulary. You couldn't take the military grammar of Fontenoy or Minden, massed fire, geometric formations, shock cavalry, and apply it unchanged to a forest where visibility was measured in yards. But Bouquet had a problem that made this intellectual preparation feel almost irrelevant. He didn't have enough men. By July of 1763, or when ordered to assemble a relief column for Fort Pitt, he was working with what was available. The British Army was stretched across its global commitments. Demobilization after the 7 Years' War was underway, units being reduced precisely when they were most needed on the frontier. He assembled approximately 460 men, elements of the 42nd Regiment of Foot, the legendary Black Watch, Scottish Highlanders who had fought with distinction throughout the 7 Years' War, and elements of the 77th Regiment, plus some additional light infantry, less than 500 men, against a coalition that had already destroyed 8 forts and could field hundreds, possibly 1,000 or more warriors in the forest between Philadelphia and Fort Pitt. He also marched under the shadow of past catastrophe. In 1755, just 8 years earlier, the General Edward Braddock had marched nearly 2,000 men toward the French Fort Duquesne, following essentially the same route Bouquet would now take. At a crossing of the Monongahela River, French and indigenous forces ambushed that column. Braddock's army broke. Officers tried to maintain line formation, the only thing they knew, while men died from invisible fire. Braddock himself was shot from his horse. Nearly 1,000 British and colonial soldiers were killed or wounded out of roughly 1,400 engaged. One of the worst defeats the British Army suffered in all of North America. The soldiers in Bouquet's column knew this history. The officers had read the reports. They understood that the terrain they were entering had swallowed a better supplied force 8 years earlier. Bouquet organized his column carefully. Our 340 supply wagons carrying flour, medicine, and relief for Fort Pitt, essential and his greatest vulnerability. The wagons could only travel the road, couldn't maneuver, anchored the column's entire route. He moved in stages through Carlisle, Shippensburg, Bedford. Rangers pushed well ahead, experienced frontier fighters who could read the forest. He knew the ambush was coming. Enough intelligence, enough instinct built on years of thinking about exactly this problem told him the corridor between Bedford and Fort Pitt was being watched. Warriors were tracking his column, counting it, choosing their moment. What he didn't know was exactly where, exactly when, in what numbers. The answer was waiting at Bushy Run Creek, and Bouquet pushed forward anyway, not from recklessness, from calculation, because he had an idea, a tactical concept he had been developing for years, drawn from his reading of indigenous warfare, from conversations with frontier veterans, from his own analysis of what had gone wrong every time a British column had been caught in these forests. We'll get to that idea. But first, August 5th, 1763, needs to happen. The warriors who had chosen to strike Bouquet's column were not improvising. They were among the most experienced guerrilla fighters in North America, men who had spent the summer destroying British forts and supply lines with systematic precision. The force opposing Bouquet included Delaware warriors, Lenape, the original people of the Delaware River Valley, displaced repeatedly westward by British colonial expansion until there was nowhere left to go. There were Shawnee, whose political and military sophistication the British consistently underestimated and consistently paid for underestimating. There were Mingo, Iroquoian peoples of the Ohio country, and Huron, and possibly others. A coalition of grievance and determination. Their leaders understood the strategic situation perfectly. Bouquet's column was the relief mission for Fort Pitt. If they could destroy it, or even badly maul it and force a retreat, Fort Pitt would be isolated. It would eventually surrender. And with Fort Pitt gone, the entire British position in the Ohio Valley was finished. This was not a raid. This was an attempt to permanently alter the strategic balance of power in North America. They chose their ground with the care of men who had spent their lives in this forest. The area around Edge Hill and Bushy Run, which approximately 26 miles east of Fort Pitt, offered everything an ambushing force could want. Rolling hills covered in old-growth forest and heavy underbrush. A trail that wound through the terrain in a way that naturally compressed and channeled a marching column. High ground on both sides of the approach, close enough to the trail for effective musket fire. Creek beds and ravines that provided covered approach routes for warriors moving into position. There was also a psychological component to the timing. Bouquet's column had left Fort Ligonier on August 4th at 5 o'clock in the morning, pushing hard. They covered roughly 17 miles in August heat, an enormous effort for soldiers in wool uniforms carrying 60-pound packs and escorting hundreds of supply wagons. By August 5th, they had been on the road before dawn again, pushing toward Bushy Run Creek, where they intended to camp and water the horses. The horses could smell the water ahead, pulling the vanguard forward faster than was perhaps prudent. The warriors watching from the tree line knew this. They had scouts tracking the column since before Fort Ligonier. They knew the column's pace, its route, its condition. They knew that after 17 miles of hard marching and heat, soldiers' reflexes slowed. Attention wavered. They chose 1 o'clock in the afternoon, 1 hour past the point when soldiers in summer heat are at their most exhausted and most desperate for water. The precision of this timing is not coincidence. This is a professional military assessment of human psychology applied to specific circumstances. These were not primitive warriors acting on instinct, and these were sophisticated military thinkers who had spent their lives studying the most demanding possible school of warfare: survival. The signal was a volley, a sudden crash of musket fire from the forest on both sides of the trail simultaneously. No warning, no declaration. The forest erupting all at once from multiple directions at close range. British soldiers in the vanguard went down immediately. The forward elements tried to form some kind of line in the narrow trail and were shot at from angles their formation couldn't address. Men were falling. Orders were shouted. But in the crash of musketry and the war cries coming from everywhere at once, the orders were lost. The flanks of the column were under fire simultaneously. The rear was being probed, but the wagons in the center were stationary. Drivers trying to control panicking horses, horses being shot and collapsing in harness, creating obstacles that blocked any movement. For a long, terrible moment, it looked like Braddock's disaster all over again. And Henry Bouquet, somewhere in that column, heard the firing start and understood exactly what was happening. He had thought about this moment for years. The ideas that had lived only in his head suddenly needed to become real decisions. Under fire, with men dying around him. Now let's break this down. Because the tactical situation Bouquet faced is extraordinary in its difficulty, and the solution he arrived at, first intuitively, then with increasing confidence, is a masterclass in adaptive military thinking under the worst possible conditions. First, the terrain. For the trail approaching Edge Hill runs through what you would now recognize as Pennsylvania hardwood forest. Towering oaks, chestnuts, hickories, with a dense understory of saplings and brush. The ground is not flat. It rolls in gentle but significant hills, and the trail itself runs along the lower slopes, with higher ground on multiple sides. The creek bottom, Bushy Run, offers natural concealment for approaching forces. The overall picture is a landscape that funnels movement onto the trail and puts the surrounding high ground in the hands of anyone patient enough to occupy it before the column arrives. For Bouquet's soldiers, this terrain created several simultaneous tactical problems that compounded each other. Problem 1: visibility. In this forest, effective visibility from the trail was measured in yards, not hundreds of yards. You're at ranges of 30 to 50 feet. Soldiers firing volleys at an enemy they couldn't see were spending ammunition on nothing. Muskets of this era required a visible target to be effective. The warriors they were fighting understood this perfectly. They moved between trees, fired, moved again, never presenting themselves as stationary targets. British soldiers trained to fire shoulder to shoulder at clearly visible enemies in open fields had no target to shoot at. They were firing at muzzle flashes and movement. Problem 2: formation. British infantry doctrine of 1763 was built around the line formation. Men shoulder to shoulder, 3 ranks deep, capable of delivering a devastating coordinated volley. In the narrow trail through the forest, a true line was impossible. The men who tried to form line were crowded into the trail itself or pushed into undergrowth so thick they couldn't maneuver. The formation that made British infantry lethal in Europe was useless in Pennsylvania. Problem 3: the wagons. 340 wagons full of supplies were the mission. They were also anchors. They couldn't maneuver. They couldn't be abandoned without forfeiting the relief mission and leaving Fort Pitt to fall. They occupied the center of the column and created a massive, stationary mass that the warriors could fire into at will. And the animals that pulled them, already exhausted from hard marching, now terrified by the noise of battle, were adding their own chaos to the scene. Dead horses in harness, panicking horses fighting their drivers, wagons blocking any attempt at movement. Problem 4: the perimeter. In a forest ambush, you don't know where the attack is coming from next. You know it's coming from multiple directions simultaneously. Every direction you face to respond is a direction where your back is exposed. Classic European military doctrine offered no answer for this. It assumed a clear front and a clear rear. Here, the front was everywhere. Bouquet's initial response was the textbook light infantry response for frontier conditions. He pushed troops onto the higher ground around the trail, trying to take the positions from which the warriors were firing. This was intelligent. Get to the high ground, establish a perimeter, stabilize the situation. The problem was that the warriors didn't defend the high ground. They gave it up. They fell back, fluid, silent, disappearing into the undergrowth. The British soldiers charged up the slopes expecting to close with the enemy and found trees, empty positions, movement somewhere deeper in the forest. And as soon as the British soldiers were extended on that high ground, the warriors simply moved around them, resumed fire from new positions, and the situation reset. Imagine trying to grab smoke with your hands. Every time you close your fingers, it's already moved. This is the fundamental tactical principle of guerrilla warfare that European militaries spent 2 centuries learning the hard way. An unconventional force that controls the terrain does not need to hold ground. It needs only to deny the enemy the ability to organize, resupply, or rest. The warriors didn't need to defeat Bouquet's column in a head-to-head engagement. They just needed to keep it from functioning, keep it disorganized, keep it in the open, unable to retreat and unable to advance. Bleeding slowly from fire, it couldn't effectively answer. By evening on August 5th, Bouquet had managed to establish a defensive perimeter on a low hill near Bushy Run Creek. He had lost approximately 60 men, killed and wounded. Enormous casualties for a force of less than 500. The column was encircled. The warriors held the surrounding forest in virtually every direction. The horses had been pulled into the center of the perimeter because leaving them outside meant losing them. The wounded were laid on flour sacks in the center of the ring, and the sound of their suffering added to the psychological pressure on the men surrounding them. There was no resupply coming, no reinforcement. Where the column was exactly where the ambush had intended it to be. Stationary, isolated, bleeding, unable to advance, unable to retreat. Bouquet knew that if nothing changed, the outcome was predictable. Another day of this, and the casualties would mount past what the small force could sustain. The warriors were patient. They could maintain the siege indefinitely, rotating fighters, resting in shifts, while the British were pinned without sleep or fresh water. He needed a different idea, not an adjustment to existing doctrine. A different idea entirely. He found it in the dark, sitting with his officers around a small fire in the center of the perimeter, the sound of his wounded men around him. The warriors' occasional fire, a reminder that the forest was still watching. The idea was brutal in its simplicity, and terrifying in what it required. Bouquet was going to pretend to break. He was going to create, deliberately, the appearance of exactly what the warriors expected to happen. British soldiers losing their nerve. British line infantry attempting to retreat in disorder. The moment of victory that every ambushing force waits for. The moment when the pressure becomes too much and the besieged force makes the desperate decision to run. And then, when the warriors emerged from the forest to pursue what looked like a collapsing column, he was going to kill them. This is the concept. The detail of how he intended to execute it, how you make a controlled retreat look like panic without it becoming actual panic, how you create a killing ground in a forest where killing grounds don't exist, how you reverse the fundamental dynamic of a forest ambush in a single, explosive moment. That is the tactical genius of Bushy Run. And to understand it, you need to understand one more thing about the psychology of pursuit. When a hunter sees prey begin to run, the hunter follows. This is not stupidity. This is the rational response to centuries of warfare experience that had taught indigenous warriors that a retreating European column, once broken, could be pursued and destroyed at minimal cost. They had watched British soldiers break before, at Braddock's defeat, at a dozen smaller engagements. Once the formation collapsed, once the soldiers scattered into the forest as individuals, the military advantage swung completely to the warriors who knew the terrain. Running soldiers died, but running soldiers tripped over roots and couldn't reload. Running soldiers threw away their muskets and tried to hide in ravines. Running soldiers were helpless. Bouquet was counting on them knowing this, counting on them believing it would happen again, counting on the confidence of men who had watched this pattern repeat multiple times to believe that what they were seeing on August 6th was real. Think about that. He was building a trap out of his enemy's experience. He was going to use their own military intelligence against them. August 6th, 1763. Dawn. The perimeter on the hill above Bushy Run Creek is very quiet. Men who haven't slept properly in 2 days are on their feet, in position, and trying to read orders that have been passed in whispers along the line, because Bouquet doesn't want anything shouted that might carry into the forest. Some of them don't fully understand what's being asked of them. Some of them do understand, and the understanding doesn't make them feel better. What they're being asked to do is one of the most psychologically demanding things you can ask of a trained soldier. They're being asked to retreat on purpose, not a tactical withdrawal to a better position, a retreat. A visible, public retreat from their defensive position, back the way they came, with the full expectation that the warriors in the forest will see it and pursue. Bouquet's plan? worked out in the hours before dawn with his senior officers, was this. He would pull 2 companies, roughly 80 to 100 men, from the right of his defensive line, creating what would look from the forest like a gap, a weakness, a point where the British formation was thinning, where the perimeter was being reduced, where perhaps the men were beginning to crack. He would then have those 2 companies retreat visibly down the trail to the right, falling back behind the hill. Not sprinting, not in obvious panic, that would look staged. Walking back, with the particular kind of controlled speed that looks, from a distance, like men who are afraid but trying not to show it. Men who are retreating because they think they're about to be overrun, not men who have rehearsed their exit. This was the signal the warriors would be watching for. This was the pattern they had seen before. The British formations thinning on a flank, soldiers moving backward, the beginning of the collapse. And when they emerged from the tree line to exploit the apparent gap, when they crossed the open ground between the forest and the British position, committed and exposed, the 2 companies that had retreated behind the hill were going to loop around the back of the position in a wide flanking arc, through the forest to the left, come out on the other side, and seal the exit. The warriors in pursuit of the apparent collapse would find themselves in a different kind of ambush. Not woods this time. Open ground, with a British defensive position in front of them and troops appearing on their flank. The ambush would become the ambushed. The trap was elegant. It was also completely dependent on everyone executing their role with precision and nerve, under conditions of enormous stress and real danger. If the retreating companies actually panicked, if the flanking arc took too long, and the warriors broke off pursuit before the trap was sprung, if the warriors recognized what was happening and held their position in the forest, if the timing was off by 5 minutes in either direction, any of those things would turn the trick into a disaster. The retreating companies would be caught in the open with no support, and the remnant defensive position would face a renewed assault from warriors who now knew exactly where the weak point was. This is the razor's edge Bouquet was choosing to walk. He positioned his forces carefully before dawn, and he picked the companies assigned to the feigned retreat with care. Experienced men, steady men, men he believed would maintain their nerve through the most terrifying part of the plan, which was not the trap itself, but the retreat. Walking backwards from a defensive position while men in the forest shot at you, trusting that the plan would work, trusting that the flanking companies would appear when they were supposed to appear, required a very particular kind of disciplined courage. He assigned the flanking companies, the ones who would make the circuit through the forest and close the trap, to officers he trusted completely. Major John Campbell, Captain William Grant. These were experienced combat officers who had survived some of the hardest fighting of the 7 Years' War. They understood the timing required, or they understood that arriving 30 seconds too early would reveal the plan, and 30 seconds too late would leave their comrades exposed in the open. He was also counting on something he couldn't fully control: the behavior of the enemy. He needed the warriors to pursue. If they were cautious, if they saw the retreat and held their position, waiting, suspicious, the plan failed. Everything depended on the confidence, the momentum, the military instincts of men who had watched British formations collapse before. And in the early morning light of August 6th, 1763, Henry Bouquet gave the order. The 2 companies on the right of the line began to move back. The warriors saw it immediately. They had been watching the British perimeter from the tree line since before dawn, counting positions, tracking the movement of officers, reading the telltale signs of an army under pressure, the restlessness, the frequent looks over shoulders, the quiet conversations between officers that the men around them watched with the particular anxiety of soldiers waiting to learn whether things are as bad as they fear. When the right flank of the British position began to thin, When men who had been standing there moments before were now moving backward into the trail, retreating, it confirmed what the warriors had anticipated. The night had done its work. The casualties, the isolation, the knowledge that there was no relief coming, no help, no escape that didn't run through the warriors now pressing on every side. The British were breaking. The warriors at the front of the forest moved first, emerged from the tree line, crossing the open ground, but pressing toward the apparent gap. Their movement triggered the men beside them. In pursuit situations, initiative is contagious. One man moves and the line moves. The momentum of a successful ambush transitioning to a pursuit is one of the most powerful forces in guerrilla warfare. You feel the enemy turning. You move. More warriors emerged, from the trees to the right, from the brush to the left, converging on the gap, moving fast, confident, and then, from the forest to the left, from a direction nobody had been looking, from ground that had seemed empty moments before, came the flanking companies. 100 men of the 42nd Highlanders, moving fast, appearing as if from the earth itself, cutting across the line of pursuit. The world turned inside out. But warriors who had been pursuing a retreat were suddenly facing organized musket fire on their flank. The British soldiers in the remaining defensive position, the ones who had held their ground, were no longer absorbing fire passively. They were charging. Forward. Out of the perimeter. Bayonets fixed. Screaming. The sound of the Highland charge was something that soldiers across multiple wars described as physically arresting. The 42nd's battle cry, a Gaelic war shout that had echoed on fields from Fontenoy to Ticonderoga, hit men in the stomach as much as the ears. And these were men who, seconds before, had believed they were pursuing a victory. Men who had not braced themselves for impact because they hadn't known impact was coming. The gap closed, as warriors who had entered the open ground between the trees and the British position found retreat suddenly complicated. The flanking companies were cutting off the left exit. The charge from the main position was coming at them from the front. The right was now occupied by the two companies who had conducted the feigned retreat, who had looped, steady, and disciplined, and were now coming back at the run. The warriors who had been the jaws of the ambush found themselves inside one. The fighting in that brief, violent interval was brutal. At close range, muskets fired once and then reversed as clubs or abandoned for bayonets. There to the Black Watch, Scottish Highlanders who had spent generations developing a reputation for ferocity in hand-to-hand fighting, drove into the warriors with the particular intensity of men who had been on the receiving end of forest ambush for 2 days and were now, finally, fighting on terms they understood. Close, physical, visceral. The warriors broke, not in the slow, contested way that an army breaks under sustained pressure. Suddenly, in the way a line breaks when it suddenly realizes the geometry of the situation has shifted against it. Individual warriors turned, ran. The contagious panic that had broken British formations before now ran through the pursuing force in reverse. Men who had entered the open ground in confidence exited it in survival mode. The pursuit was brief, but devastating. And British soldiers, released from the static defensive posture they had held for a day and a half, finally able to move, finally fighting in the open, pushed after the retreating warriors with maximum aggression. The forest that had sheltered attackers now provided cover for retreat. The warriors knew its paths. Some escaped, but the pursuit extracted a heavy toll. By the time the firing stopped, by the time the sound of battle faded from the hillside above Bushy Run Creek, the battlefield had been transformed. The ambush was broken. The besieging force was gone from the forest around the position. The perimeter that had felt like a death trap 12 hours earlier was now the center of a battlefield that Bouquet's column controlled. The losses on both sides were real and painful, Bouquet's force had suffered roughly 50 killed and 60 wounded out of approximately 460 men engaged. Serious casualties, the kind of numbers that haunt commanders. He would write later about the cost in terms that were not triumphant, but reflective. The weight of every specific name, every man he had known. The losses among the warriors are harder to establish with precision. Indigenous oral histories and the limitations of colonial record-keeping mean we don't have the same clarity. Estimates range from 60 to perhaps 100 killed. The specific leaders involved survived. This was not a battle that decapitated the indigenous coalition militarily, but the force that had besieged Bouquet's column, that had been positioned to prevent Fort Pitt's relief, was driven from the field. And on August 10th, 1763, Henry Bouquet's column, battered, diminished, carrying its wounded in improvised litters, marched into Fort Pitt. The garrison, which had been under siege for nearly 2 months, watched them come through the gates with the particular emotion that only people who have genuinely given up hope can feel when hope suddenly materializes. Relief and disbelief mixed together. The sound of soldiers inside cheering was, according to one account, audible on the opposite bank of the Ohio River. Fort Pitt did not fall. The Western British position did not collapse. And the decoy, the feigned retreat that nobody had ever tried in North American forest warfare, the trick that reversed an ambush in real time, had worked. The Battle of Bushy Run did not end Pontiac's war. Let me be clear about that, because history deserves its complexity. Yet the conflict continued into 1764. Pontiac himself continued to advocate for resistance. Some nations kept fighting. The military situation across the Great Lakes remained volatile through the end of 1763 and into the following year. Pontiac would not formally end his resistance until a negotiated peace in 1766. But Bushy Run was the decisive turning point. Not because it destroyed the indigenous military capacity, it didn't. Not because it resolved the fundamental political grievances that ignited the war, it didn't do that either. But because it demonstrated for the first time that the British Army was capable of matching and defeating forest warfare tactics on the forest's own terms. That the ambush technique which had made the entire Western military position seem untenable was not invincible. Not the psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. Every warrior coalition that had spent the summer watching British forts fall and British columns disintegrate now had to reckon with the possibility that the equation had changed. Bouquet had shown that a disciplined, intelligently led British force could absorb an ambush, adapt in real time, and reverse it. That required a different calculus, a different risk assessment. Fort Pitt's survival meant the Ohio Valley remained in British hands, which meant the strategic logic of the 7 Years' War held. Britain controlled the trans-Appalachian interior, not France, and not a coalition of indigenous nations that had come agonizingly close to expelling British military power from the continent's interior. But the long-term consequences are where history becomes simultaneously fascinating and deeply uncomfortable. In November of 1763, King George III issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763. He drew a line along the crest of the Appalachian Mountains and declared that British colonists were not to settle west of it. The interior, the Ohio Valley, the Great Lakes region, everything west to the Mississippi, was reserved for indigenous peoples. On paper, a remarkable concession. In practice, it was widely ignored almost immediately. Colonists and land speculators who had anticipated post-war access to Western lands were furious. George Washington called it absurd in private correspondence. Within 12 years, those same colonists were fighting the American Revolution. When that revolution ended in 1783, or the Treaty of Paris, the second in 20 years, transferred the Ohio Valley to the new United States. The proclamation was dead. And the indigenous nations of the interior, who had not agreed to British sovereignty in 1763 and had not agreed to American sovereignty in 1783, were not at the negotiating table. Two empires transferred territories they did not own, and the people who actually lived there were given nothing. Henry Bouquet would go on to lead another major expedition into the Ohio Valley in 1764, forcing the return of captives and a formal peace from the Delaware and Shawnee. He was promoted to brigadier general in 1765. He was appointed commander of British forces in the Southern Department and was preparing to take up that posting when he contracted yellow fever in Pensacola, Florida. He died in September 1765, just 2 years after Bushy Run, at the age of 46. He is buried in Pensacola. The battle he won at a Pennsylvania creek is largely forgotten outside military history circles, despite being one of the most tactically innovative engagements of the colonial era. The warriors who fought him, the Delaware and Shawnee and their allies, continued to resist colonial expansion for decades. The Shawnee, in particular, produced leaders of extraordinary quality in the following generation: Cornstalk, Blue Jacket, and ultimately Tecumseh, who would attempt, in the early 19th century, a pan-indigenous coalition that was the culmination of what Pontiac had first attempted in 1763. Tecumseh came closer to succeeding than most people know. His death at the Battle of the Thames in 1813 ended the last realistic possibility of a politically independent indigenous nation in the eastern interior of North America. All of these threads run forward from that August afternoon in 1763. From a hillside above a Pennsylvania creek. From a decision made in the dark, surrounded by wounded men, in a forest that had already killed too many. Bushy Run Battlefield is a Pennsylvania state park today. 213 acres of preserved land near the modern town of Harrison City. You can walk the trail. You can stand on the hill where the perimeter was established. You can look at the ground where the wounded were laid and listen to the birds that now fill the forest silence. The quiet is absolute. No muskets, no war cries, no horses screaming in harness. Just the Pennsylvania forest being what it has always been, old and patient and indifferent to the humans who have moved through it. But if you know what happened here, the quiet feels loaded, heavy with something that isn't exactly sadness, and isn't exactly awe, and isn't exactly warning. All three, maybe, all three at once. Think about what this battle asks us to sit with. A military genius executed a perfect tactical deception under fire, saving hundreds of lives and potentially altering the political trajectory of a continent. And the people who nearly defeated him, who took 8 forts, who built a resistance that came within one battle of changing everything, were fighting for something that Bouquet's victory ultimately failed to protect: their land, their sovereignty, their right to exist in the world without being transferred like property between empires that never asked their opinion. Both of those things are true at the same time. The tactical brilliance is real. The justice of the cause it defeated is also real. History rarely offers the comfort of simple heroes and uncomplicated victories. It offers us human beings making desperate choices in terrible circumstances, and the consequences of those choices rippling forward through centuries until they reach us, sitting here, watching a screen, thinking about a creek in Pennsylvania. I want to hear from you. What struck you most about this story? The tactical elegance of the feigned retreat? The extraordinary military skill of the warriors who nearly destroyed the British relief column? The tragedy of Bouquet dying at 46? He never seeing what his victory ultimately meant? The deep injustice baked into the long aftermath? Leave your thoughts below. These are not questions with easy answers. They're not supposed to be. The best history never has them. If this video made you think, really think, then please subscribe. I make these not to give you simple answers, but to give you better questions. The world makes more sense when you understand how it was made. And the people who made it, not just the generals, but the soldiers at Bushy Run, the warriors in the Pennsylvania forest, the 500 people waiting behind stone walls at the fork of the Ohio River. They deserve to be understood as fully as possible, not as symbols, as people. What Bushy Run ultimately teaches us is that the most dangerous force on any battlefield is not the largest army or the most sophisticated weapon. It is the prepared mind that refuses to be limited by what has always been done. Bouquet faced an impossible situation and invented a solution that didn't exist before he needed it. The warriors he faced were doing exactly the same thing, taking the problem of superior British firepower and inventing a tactical system to defeat it. Both sides, facing existential pressure, created something new. We are still living in the world their creativity made, still tracing the lines they drew, with muskets, with bayonets, with desperate plans made in the dark before dawn. Still trying to understand what those lines mean, and whether we can do better than the people who drew them. And that question belongs to us now. And what we do with it is the only part of this story that hasn't been written yet.